Bob Greenberg is a physician and the chairman of the board of Second Sight Medical Products and the Alfred Mann Foundation. That is not him. That's him. He actually developed and brought to market the world's most advanced implantable nerve stimulator. He has over 400 issued patents, and he's going to talk to us today about visual prostheses.
Thanks, Lisa. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. And it's an honor to speak with this group of folks. And we're not getting the output now. Okay. Voila. Okay, great. Second Sight is a public company, so I need to tell you that I can't predict the future. You can read all those words if you want later. So the problem that I've taken on is a large, previously unmet medical need, and that's blindness. And here you can see some various forms of blindness and the numbers of people that are affected by it. Retinitis pigmentosa is a hereditary disease that we're treating today with the Argus retinal prosthesis, which is commercially available. And retinitis pigmentosa is an awful disease to get. It's something that patients will often, in their 20s, go to an ophthalmologist having difficulty seeing at night, thinking that perhaps they need a pair of glasses. And instead, they're told that they have an incurable disease that's going to cause them to go blind. And the way they're going to go blind is over the next couple decades of their life, their world is going to gradually close in on them until they're completely blind. And so that's the disease that we're treating today. We have over 250 patients now implanted with the Argus, and I'll talk about that. But as you can see from this pyramid, there are other more common diseases that cause people to go blind. Many of us may know people who suffer from age-related macular degeneration, particularly as the population continues to age. And so we have a clinical trial in the UK addressing macular degeneration with a retinal stimulator. But as you can see at the bottom, most forms of blindness actually cannot be treated by a retinal prosthesis because the optic nerve is damaged. So the cable going from the eye to the brain doesn't work. And so for that, we're bypassing the eye and going directly to stimulate the visual cortex. And so with that background, this started for me as a graduate student, MD, PhD student at Johns Hopkins, with the idea that we could restore vision by electrically activating the remaining cells in the retina, so cells that were still intact. It turns out, when we looked at histology, postmortem histology of patients with retinitis pigmentosa, there were still some cells that were alive, even though the photoreceptors, the cells that normally change the light into the chemical electrical signal going back to the brain, were damaged. And so we hypothesized that if we could electrically activate electrodes on the surface of that retina, the back of the retina is visiotopically mapped or spatially mapped, we could produce the perception of vision. So that was the concept. It was kind of this concept had been done before with cochlear implants. So cochlear implants were electrical implants that restored hearing to deaf patients, which had been extraordinarily successful. And so the question was, could we do a cochlear implant for the eye? So the first thing that, and this was actually my introduction to the project, was the first question was, could you, under local anesthesia, could you place electrodes in the back of these blind patients' eyes? And here you can see one of the end on, and here's the probe in the surgeon's hand. Could you place a probe in an awake patient's eye with retinitis pigmentosa, and would they see anything? And I'll play this video this was one of the very first experiments we did.
Tell us if you see anything once again. All right.
And this is the surgeon's view, not the patient's view. So it's the audio that matters.
How many do you see? 1 or 2 or 3 or more?
There's 2, if not 3. I still read them 2s together.
Okay. Are they closer or further apart now than what they were just a minute ago?
Closer.
Okay. Okay, how close are they now?
Oh, a quarter of an inch.
Okay, are they the same size or are they different sizes?
I would say the one to the right might be larger than one in the center.
Okay, tell us if you see anything.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How many do you see?
2, 3.
Now, the reason this is jumping around is the patient is awake and they're moving their eye, and the surgeon is holding the probe in the patient's eye under local anesthesia and trying to hold it within a ½ millimeter of the retinal surface. We found out that if you were further than a ½ millimeter, the patient wouldn't see anything. And if the surgeon touches the retina, then they'll damage the retina. So it was an incredibly heroic experiment. The surgeon was always exhausted by the end of it. And we could only test about 45 minutes is really the max that you could get. And so, but through this, we saw that the patient could reliably see 1 spot of light when we activated 1 electrode and see 2 spots of light especially when we had multiple probes that were far apart, they could see 2 spots of light. And really that, for me, as a first-year medical student, that was all I needed. I had a background in electrical engineering, and I figured, well, this is just an engineering problem now. If the patient can see 2 spots of light, if we can do 100 spots or 1,000 spots, they can see video. That was almost 30 years ago. After graduate school, I spent a little bit of time at the FDA reviewing medical devices, and while I was at the FDA, I met this individual, Alfred Mann, who I had the good fortune of spending the last, working closely with the last 20 years of his life. And he had a nonprofit research foundation, the Alfred Mann Foundation, which really specialized in developing and commercializing medical devices for unmet clinical needs. So these were typically products that were too early for a company. And so the goal of the foundation is to bridge the translational research from often an academic lab. In the case of cochlear implants, they came out of UCSF right here in town. And to bridge the technology to early clinical trials so that they could be spun off into companies. And these are just a few of the products that have been developed from the foundation over the year, and they've resulted in companies that have created tremendous value for the patients. And I'll focus on Second Sight, which is the company that I co-founded with Mr. Mann back in 1998. And the first project, or the first thing we tried to do actually, is we knew from the early experiments at Hopkins, where we had tested about 24 patients, that these patients could see spots of light, at least in the operating room. But the question is, could you do it chronically? Could you do it over a long period of time? And so we borrowed the cochlear implant that the foundation had developed, put a new electrode array on it, and so you could see here, we implanted the 6 patients with devices that went behind the ear, so the cochlear implant went where it normally went. And instead of putting an electrode array into the ear to restore hearing, we ran the electrode array to the eye. And here you can see an electrode array sitting in the back of the eye. And we developed this very small little spring-loaded micro tack to hold the electrodes in place. These were only 16 electrode stimulators, so they only had, there's a 4x4 grid you can see here. So relatively crude. But we were surprised, and this was really just meant as an experiment. This was patient number 6 with Alan Alda, and this was actually the very first time that we had a patient went outside the lab. And it was actually Alan Alda that convinced us. He's like, what could happen? Let's go outside and see what happens. A couple years later, the BBC interviewed one of our Argus 1 patients, and I'll play this video. And after seeing this video for the first time, I actually called the patient to apologize, and I think you'll see why in a second.
No one expects Grandma to play like a professional, but for Linda Morford, that any ball goes in is amazing. She's totally blind. The small circle in her glasses is a camera, and some clever electronics turns the images into patterns of dark and light. It may not sound like much, but for Linda, it's made a huge difference.
So I called her to apologize because I thought, the BBC was sensationalizing what she was able to do, because I thought there's no way someone with a 4x4 grid could possibly hit a basket. And when I spoke to her, she explained that actually she had been playing basketball with her grandson when she was interviewed by the BBC, and the way she was able to do it was through scanning. And so this was an example of where the patients taught us that relatively few pixels were enough to sort of triangulate. So if you kind of make a tunnel vision and scan the world, your brain can integrate that and give you a lot more information than you would expect from relatively few pixels. Another fun story with the Argus One was that the very first time we tried this, we didn't have the camera yet. The camera was a handheld camera, and so we implanted this modified cochlear implant in the first patient, and we shined on the wall an L, and with a projector, and so you can see kind of here's a similar experiment with just a line, and we asked the patient. There were probably a dozen people in the room at the time, and we asked the patient, what do you see? And he starts shaking his head, and we're like, oh, it didn't work. And so you could feel the energy in the room drop. And then he says, all I see is a line that goes like this and a line that goes like that. And we're like, well, what is it? He's like, oh, it just looks like an L. And that was another lesson that we learned from the patients, was that the expectation of what these patients are going to see varies quite a bit, and it's often very different than what we think. So we had a lot of interest in commercializing this Argus One. For a number of reasons, we decided not to. We thought the Argus Two was right around the corner. That's another theme, is that these things end up taking a lot longer than you think. There were a lot of challenges, and so for the Argus 2, the goal was more electrodes. This was a 60 electrode device. We also wanted it to be completely within the eye, so the Argus 1 was an 8-hour surgery, so it took 4 surgeons 8 hours to implant the Argus 1. The Argus 2 can be implanted in under 2 hours by a single surgeon. So we felt like the Argus 2, with more electrodes and more easily surgically accessible, was a better sort of first commercial product. But there were a lot of technical challenges that we had to meet to make the Argus 2 practical. The most important was the long-term reliability. So putting electronics in the body is like taking your television and throwing it in the ocean and having it still work. And not only that, but now you need to miniaturize your television into about the size of an aspirin, so it would fit on the eye. So a lot of solving those technical issues was a big reason for all of the patents and the new technology we had to develop to make it possible. And so here's a short video of the Argus 2.
Now, in this week's edition of Wiring the World, the Bionic Eye may sound like science fiction, but now it is a reality. Bloomberg's Ramy Inocencio has that story.
I'm waiting to see some waves here.
For Alan Zarin, many firsts. With wife Carmen at his side, it's his first time seeing the famous Ferris wheel at Santa Monica Pier. The thing is, he's totally blind. Has been the past 25 years from incurable eye decay called retinitis pigmentosa. But since February, he's seeing again with this wearable by Los Angeles-based Second Sight.
What I see is a series of flashes of light, and the brighter ones obviously like a door handle or a doorknob or a frame or something like that. I'll be able to see that is what it is.
This is how it works. A camera on a pair of glasses transmits images wirelessly to a layer of 60 tiny electrodes on the retina inside the eyeball. Alan can't see fine features. The Argus 2 is still limited, but he did see his wife again this February as the world's 15th person. Thesis.
Carmen?
Dr. Greenberg.
Today, another first. Alan meets Bob Greenberg, the man behind his Second Sight.
Give it a shot and see what happens.
Bob also checks Alan's vision, walking a white line on a black mat.
I lost the line as I started walking.
Over a series of tries.
Give me
So, what do people see? Bob puts me in a simulator.
This is a half moon. This is a triangle. This is a circle.
Outside the research lab, Alan keeps exploring. This week at Disneyland. Seeing Mickey Mouse.
And is it shaped like this?
The Enchanted Castle. And this.
Oh, there.
Technology. Wiring up eyes to the world for a chance at second sight.
Oh, look at that.
So one of the challenges in commercializing this was there were really no assessments for these patients. I mean, we were taking patients that had bare or no light perception. So these patients were completely blind. And we weren't bringing them up to what's traditionally used for assessing vision, the eye chart. We weren't bringing them up to that level of vision, but instead, we were actually bringing them into this range. So, a point where they could count fingers and they could get around, and kind of like a blurry black and white television, but life-changing, as you saw, if you're completely blind. So we actually had to develop tests that we co-developed with a number of people in the low vision community, and along with the FDA as well. So this was something where it was a collaborative effort of both ourselves and a number of researchers and the FDA. And so we came up with progressively, increasingly difficult tests, and these were touchscreen monitor tests where the simplest test, we would ask the patient to identify a square on a screen. Slightly more difficult test, a patient would have to identify which direction a line was sweeping. And then the most difficult test was a fine grading visual acuity, where we could actually measure increasingly fine gradings and ask the patient, is it vertical, horizontal, up and to the right, or up and to the left? And those were all well and good, but the FDA asked us, well, can the person actually use the vision? And so we developed these two mobility tests where the patient would stand at one end of the room and a door would be placed in one of two locations, and the patient would have to walk to the door. And the more difficult test, which you saw in the video, is the patient in the line test, a line would either go straight to the right or to the left, and the patient would have to start on one end of the line and end up on the, a successful test would be, they would be standing on the other end of the line at the end, which without vision obviously is impossible. Or at least you would score it at chance. And here are the results. And one of the important things here is that these results are stable for many years. This is a paper we published in Ophthalmology that 5 years out. Some of these patients are now 10 years out, and the devices are still functioning well. And you can see here these are the results for the square localization. Patients they perform much better with the device on versus off. That was the other thing that was interesting, is these patients could be their own controls. So because we could shut the device off. And similarly for the door, line, direction of motion, and grading acuity tasks, the results were sustained over a long period of time. So the device, there are about 60 papers that have been published so far on the Argus. It was approved in Europe in 2011 and received FDA approval in 2013. These were some of the awards written about the Argus. And it's growing in availability. There are about 50 centers now worldwide where patients can get the Argus. Over 250 patients have received it so far. And Medicare is covering it right now. For 2018, Medicare will reimburse $122,500 for the Argus, and it's reimbursed in most of the countries in Europe as well. Most of the largest medical device companies. And here you can see the sort of growing number of implants starting in 2012 when it became commercially available in Europe to today. So what's next? So the original Argus 2 and the version that's still commercial was designed about 15 years ago, to give you an idea of how long these things take. And in fact, the battery on the Argus 2 is a camcorder battery. It's something that I thought, well, people will always be able to get camcorder batteries. So they'll go to their Radio Shack and pick up a camcorder battery, both of which are gone now. So we have a next generation externals that will release this year, and there are a number of things that these new glasses will allow. One of the features, of course, is that it looks more like a normal pair of glasses. The original one was a pair of Oakley sunglasses that had a camera stuck on it, and the other is the processing power is about 25-fold. Of what our original processing power was. So we can do a lot more on the image processing side of things. And now with a longer battery life with the updates in both the efficiency of the processor and also the digital camera, as opposed to the original one was an analog camera. And this new one is also software upgradable. So much like upgrading your iPhone, this new system will be web-enabled so that we can do remote downloads of new software as we develop new algorithms. And so an example of that is one of the things that we've shown in the clinic is that we've been able to provide various colors to these patients that are repeatable. The commercial version, the Argus 2 today, though, is black and white. So I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that today we're only really treating the tip of this iceberg, and our goal has been from the beginning to eliminate blindness and treat all patients. But the majority of the patients have an optic nerve that's damaged, so we can't treat them with a retinal prosthesis. We have to go deeper into the system, and we've chosen to go all the way to the visual cortex to move the device further back from the retina. And we're not the first ones to think of doing this. There was a fellow, Bill Dobell, who, as far back as the 1970s, actually wired electrodes through the skull into patients and had them hooked up to a rack of electronics. And patients were able to see phosphenes. And here you can see one of those patients actually a mapping experiment where they were asking the patient to point where they saw the spots of light. Fast forward to 2000, and Bill Dobell came up with a relatively portable version of this, but they still had a large cable going through the head. I mean, these are pretty heroic experiments. I mean, you can imagine somebody getting one, and in some cases, patients got bilateral implants. And then here in 2002, again, semi-portable. The major problem, though, with these patients is that they had seizures and that the devices eventually stopped working. So those were the two challenges and the reason why this never really took off. They implanted about 16 patients with those devices. So about a year ago, we implanted a patient with an epilepsy stimulator that was intended for epilepsy, but we used it just to test the concept. We wanted to see, could we do it without seizures? Could we do it without the device failing? And long story short, all 8 contacts in this device, it was only an 8-contact device, produced phosphenes. This patient's over a year out now. Continuing to get phosphenes on all 8 electrodes. So it was really the crude engineering of that first device is what we suspected. And there have been no serious adverse events, including no seizures in this patient. But this was just an experiment, a single patient experiment. And what we really wanted to do is hook the patient up, and this is some of the data from that, showing that the thresholds were stable over time. But what we really wanted to do is modify an Argus and put it in a patient. And so here you can see that the concept is an electrode grid over the visual cortex using an Argus. And late last year, we got approval from the FDA for a 5-patient, 2-center human clinical trial. And this trial has begun now at UCLA and Baylor, where we'll be implanting the first 5 patients with an Orion cortical prosthesis. This is a 60-channel electrical stimulator, basically a modified Argus 2, taking advantage of everything that we learned from developing the Argus 2. And so on January 30th, we implanted our first patient at UCLA, and maybe it's appropriate that this was the first thing that I saw as we approached the operating room. It was the Rodney Dangerfield operating room. And here's the patient one day post-op. So this is a CT scan. So the devices aren't yet qualified for MRI. They should be MR compatible, but we haven't yet qualified them for MR. So we have pre-op MR. And so here you can see the electrode array over the visual cortex. You can see the artifact for the implant. You can just barely make out the cable. And these are the staples in the skin post-op. These are the externals, so you can see it looks just like the Argus 2, except for the coil we've moved from the eye now to the back of the head. So this is just our experimental system. And I'm going to have to leave it with a cliffhanger for the results, because we've just now implanted our first patient. But over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll be testing these patients. And the hope is that the results are at least as good as the Argus 2, where we can provide benefit to a lot more patients. Okay, all right. I'll be around if you have questions.